A heated moment on daytime TV leaves the hosts divided and viewers stunned. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn and begins to reveal deeper disagreements that were never planned for the cameras? That's exactly what unfolded during a daytime talk show segment that began like many others, calm, conversational, and familiar, before slowly shifting into something more tense and revealing. And before we walk through exactly how that moment developed, make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The episode in question opened with a standard roundtable discussion centered on women in Hollywood and the evolving conversation around feminism in entertainment. It was a topic the show had returned to many times before, especially with high-profile guests who had spoken publicly about gender roles, power, and expectations placed on women in the public eye. Scarlett Johansson was invited on the show to promote an upcoming project, and from the moment she took her seat at the table, the tone was friendly and welcoming. The hosts greeted her warmly, exchanged a few light remarks about her career longevity, and briefly touched on how long audiences had been watching her grow up on screen. The early minutes of the segment moved at an easy pace. Johansson spoke about balancing work with privacy, the challenge of navigating public commentary, and how conversations around women in film had shifted over the years. The panel nodded along, occasionally interjecting with affirmations and small follow-up questions. Whoopi Goldberg, seated near the center of the table, listened closely, hands folded at times, occasionally leaning forward as Johansson spoke. Nothing in the opening suggested that the conversation was headed anywhere unusual. The shift began subtly, the way it often does on live television. One of the co-hosts referenced a past interview where Johansson had spoken about not wanting to be labeled as a role model simply because of her gender or career success. The question was framed neutrally, almost conversationally, asking whether her views had evolved since that earlier statement. Johansson smiled politely before answering, taking a brief pause as if choosing her words carefully. She explained that while she supported equality and opportunity for women, she sometimes felt uncomfortable with the idea that any one public figure should be expected to represent an entire movement. She emphasized personal choice, saying that feminism, to her, meant allowing women to define success on their own terms without pressure to conform to a single narrative. As she spoke, her tone remained calm and measured, but the room subtly changed. A few of the hosts shifted in their chairs, and the studio audience grew quieter, listening more intently. Whoopi Goldberg was the first to respond directly. She acknowledged Johansson's point, but gently pushed back, suggesting that visibility comes with responsibility, especially when you've reached a level of influence that few people ever do. Goldberg spoke slowly, deliberately, as she often does when she wants to be precise. She pointed out that many young women look to successful figures in entertainment for cues about confidence and empowerment, whether those figures intend to be role models or not. Johansson nodded, but her expression tightened slightly. She clarified that she wasn't rejecting responsibility outright, but resisting what she saw as a narrow definition of feminism that didn't always leave room for nuance. She spoke about how women are often scrutinized more harshly for their choices, especially when those choices don't align with what others expect from a feminist figure. Her voice remained steady, but the pacing of her words slowed, suggesting she was becoming more careful, more aware of how each sentence might land. As the exchange continued, the interruptions became more frequent, though still polite. One host attempted to bridge the perspectives, suggesting that feminism could encompass both viewpoints. Another added a brief comment about generational differences in how activism is expressed. But Goldberg returned to the core of her point, leaning forward slightly, hands now resting on the table. She spoke about the historical context of the feminist movement, emphasizing that many women before had not had the luxury of opting out of representation. The studio audience reacted with light applause at that remark, not loud, but noticeable. Johansson glanced briefly toward the audience before responding, acknowledging that history, while reiterating her belief that modern feminism should allow for individual expression without judgment. Her posture remained composed, but her shoulders were more rigid now, and she gestured with her hands more than she had earlier in the segment. At this point, The tone had clearly shifted from casual discussion to something more pointed. The hosts were still smiling, but the smiles were thinner, more professional. The moderator attempted to keep the conversation flowing smoothly, but the back and forth between Johansson and Goldberg had become the clear focus. The camera cut between close-ups more frequently, capturing reactions that might have gone unnoticed in a more relaxed segment. Goldberg responded again, this time with a slightly firmer tone, stressing that feminism, in her view, is not just about personal comfort but collective progress. She suggested that when influential women distance themselves from labels, it can unintentionally undermine efforts to push for systemic change. Her words were calm, but the weight behind them was evident, and the room seemed to hold its breath as Johansson prepared to answer. Johansson took a moment before speaking, inhaling quietly, then responding with a careful explanation of how labels can sometimes be used to box women in rather than lift them up. She emphasized that her support for equality was unwavering, but that she believed dialogue should allow space for disagreement within the movement itself. As she spoke, the audience remained silent, listening closely, and the tension in the studio was now unmistakable, though still restrained and appropriate for daytime television. By the time the segment reached its midpoint, what had started as a routine promotional interview had evolved into a nuanced and increasingly tense discussion about feminism, responsibility, and public expectation. The hosts were now more actively managing the conversation, stepping in to keep the exchange respectful and on track, even as the differences between Johansson and Goldberg became clearer with each response. And as the cameras kept rolling, it was evident that this was no longer just another celebrity interview, but a moment that viewers would continue talking about long after the show ended. As the conversation moved deeper into the topic, the atmosphere in the studio continued to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. The initial lightness of the segment had given way to something more deliberate, with each person at the table choosing words more carefully and allowing longer pauses between responses. Viewers watching at home would have noticed the change in pacing, the way the hosts leaned in slightly, and how the camera lingered on reactions a bit longer than usual. One of the co-hosts attempted to soften the tone by reframing the discussion as a generational conversation. She mentioned how younger audiences often interpret feminism differently than previous generations, and how that evolution can sometimes lead to misunderstandings rather than actual disagreement. Johansson nodded in agreement with that framing, adding that she believed much of the tension around feminism comes from people talking past each other instead of listening. Whoopi Goldberg, however, returned to the idea of accountability. She pointed out that while generational differences are real, the core issues, pay equity, representation, and safety, remain unresolved. Her voice was steady and measured, but her emphasis on certain words made it clear she felt strongly. She mentioned that public conversations about feminism can sometimes become overly focused on personal branding rather than collective action. Johansson responded by acknowledging the importance of those systemic issues, but she reiterated that she doesn't believe every woman needs to frame her identity around activism to be supportive. She explained that some women express their values through their work, philanthropy, or personal choices rather than public statements. Her tone remained calm, but her sentences became more structured, as if she wanted to be precise to avoid misinterpretation. At this point, the moderator interjected briefly to keep the discussion from becoming too narrow. She summarized both perspectives, noting that Johansson was emphasizing individual expression while Goldberg was highlighting collective responsibility. The moderator's tone was neutral, but her pacing quickened slightly, a common technique used to maintain control over a live segment when the energy becomes intense. The studio audience reacted with a mix of nods and quiet murmurs, the kind of subtle responses that don't disrupt the broadcast but signal engagement. A few people clapped softly when Goldberg mentioned historical activism, while others seemed to respond positively to Johansson's emphasis on personal autonomy. The audience wasn't taking sides loudly, but they were clearly invested. Goldberg leaned back for a moment, then leaned forward again, a familiar rhythm for viewers who know her on-air style. She spoke about her own experiences in the industry and how being visible as a woman of color had placed her in the role of an unintended spokesperson for many issues. She said that while she didn't always choose that role, She recognized that stepping into it had tangible effects for others. Johansson listened attentively, her eyes focused on Goldberg, and nodded as she spoke. When it was her turn to respond, she expressed respect for that perspective and said she understood why Goldberg felt strongly about public responsibility. However, she added that she believes there should be room for disagreement within feminism without questioning someone's commitment to equality. The conversation then moved toward how media amplifies certain voices and narratives. Another co-host mentioned how headlines often reduce nuanced statements to simplified quotes, which can create conflict where there is none. Johansson agreed, noting that some of her past comments had been taken out of context, leading to assumptions about her views that didn't reflect her full perspective. Goldberg acknowledged that media framing can be problematic, but she emphasized that public figures still have to navigate the impact of their words. She suggested that even unintended messages can shape public perception, especially when coming from someone with a large platform. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried a sense of caution, as if she was offering advice based on experience. The moderator tried to lighten the mood with a brief comment about how difficult it is to communicate complex ideas in short sound bites, which drew a small laugh from the audience. The laughter was brief, but it broke the tension for a moment. Johansson smiled and agreed, saying that nuance is often lost in the public discourse. Despite the brief moment of levity, the underlying disagreement remained. Johansson reiterated that feminism should not be a monolith and that women should not be criticized for how they choose to engage with the movement. Goldberg countered that while diversity of thought is important, there is also a need for unity when addressing systemic challenges. The pacing of the conversation slowed further, with longer pauses between statements. The camera cut to close-ups of each speaker, capturing subtle changes in expression, Johansson's careful, composed demeanor and Goldberg's thoughtful but firm gaze. The co-hosts occasionally glanced at each other, signaling awareness that the discussion was approaching a delicate balance. At one point, Johansson mentioned that she sometimes feels conversations about feminism become prescriptive, telling women what they should say or do. She stressed that empowerment should include the freedom to opt out of labels if they don't feel personally meaningful. Her voice remained steady, but her hands were clasped more tightly, suggesting a personal investment in the topic. Goldberg responded by saying that labels can be tools, and that while they can be limiting, they can also be empowering when used to mobilize people. She emphasized that the feminist label had helped bring attention to issues that might otherwise have been ignored. Her tone was reflective, but she maintained her stance that stepping away from the label can have broader implications. The studio audience remained attentive, with occasional nods and murmurs. The hosts continued to manage the conversation carefully, ensuring that both viewpoints were heard without letting the exchange become confrontational. The segment was still respectful, but the tension was now clearly part of the dynamic. By the end of this portion of the discussion, viewers could sense that both Johansson and Goldberg were speaking from deeply considered positions, shaped by different experiences and priorities. The conversation had become less about promoting a project and more about exploring what feminism means in practice, especially for women in the public eye. And as the discussion continued, the differences in their perspectives would become even more pronounced, leading to moments that viewers would later describe as some of the most candid exchanges seen on the show in recent memory. As the segment moved further along, the conversation settled into a rhythm that felt more serious and less exploratory. The early attempts to frame the discussion as a broad exchange of ideas gave way to more direct statements, though still delivered in a measured, daytime-appropriate tone. The hosts appeared keenly aware that the audience, both in the studio and at home, was now fully engaged, listening not just to what was being said, but how it was being said. The moderator glanced briefly at the time monitor before guiding the conversation back to a specific point Johansson had raised earlier about choice. She asked Johansson to expand on what personal choice looks like for women who are constantly scrutinized in the public eye. Johansson responded by describing how every statement she makes is often interpreted as a declaration of values, even when she's simply expressing a personal feeling. She explained that this pressure can sometimes discourage honest conversation because people fear being misunderstood or criticized. As Johansson spoke, the camera cut to Goldberg, who listened intently, her expression thoughtful but reserved. When Johansson finished, Goldberg took a moment before responding, a pause that viewers familiar with the show would recognize as a sign she was choosing her words carefully. She began by saying she understood the frustration of being misinterpreted, but she also emphasized that silence or neutrality can sometimes be read as indifference, even when that isn't the intention. This comment marked a noticeable shift in the exchange. Johansson straightened slightly in her chair, her posture becoming more upright. She replied that neutrality isn't the same as indifference, and that assuming intent can be just as harmful as ignoring context. Her voice remained calm, but the emphasis on certain words suggested she was pushing back more firmly than before. One of the co-hosts attempted to interject, noting that public discourse often lacks patience for nuance. She suggested that viewers sometimes want clear positions rather than layered explanations. The comment drew a few soft laughs from the audience, acknowledging a shared frustration. Johansson smiled briefly at the remark, while Goldberg nodded, acknowledging the reality of modern media. Goldberg then returned to the idea of impact versus intention. She said that while intentions matter, impact matters more when you're speaking to millions of people. She explained that younger viewers, in particular, may take cues from how public figures talk about social issues, and that ambiguity can sometimes create confusion. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried a sense of urgency rooted in experience. Johansson responded by saying that she doesn't believe clarity requires conformity. She argued that presenting a range of perspectives can actually strengthen a movement by making it more inclusive. She added that disagreement within feminism doesn't weaken it, but rather reflects the diversity of women's experiences. As she spoke, her hands moved more freely, illustrating her points, a change from her earlier, more restrained gestures. The studio audience reacted with a mix of nods and quiet applause, signaling appreciation for the complexity of the discussion. The applause was brief and controlled, not enough to disrupt the flow, but enough to register on air. The moderator allowed it to pass before gently steering the conversation forward. At this stage, the hosts began referencing specific examples from popular culture, discussing how female celebrities are often praised or criticized based on how well they align with public expectations of feminism. Johansson acknowledged that she has seen peers face backlash for choices that should be personal, such as how they dress or the roles they choose. She stressed that empowerment should include the freedom to make choices, without fear of public judgment. Goldberg responded by agreeing that judgment can be excessive, but she reiterated that visibility brings influence whether one seeks it or not. She said that when you have influence, opting out of certain conversations can feel like a missed opportunity to push for change. Her words were deliberate, and she leaned slightly forward, signaling the importance she placed on the point. The tension in the room was now more palpable, though still controlled. The co-hosts exchanged brief glances, recognizing that the conversation was approaching a more pointed moment. The moderator stepped in again, summarizing the exchange and emphasizing that both perspectives shared a common goal of equality, even if they differed in approach. Johansson acknowledged that shared goal, stating clearly that she supports gender equality and believes in advocating for fairness. She clarified that her discomfort lies not with feminism itself, but with rigid expectations around how it should be expressed. Her voice softened slightly as she spoke, suggesting an effort to bridge the gap rather than widen it. Goldberg listened, then responded by saying that movements are rarely comfortable and that discomfort can be part of progress. She explained that feminism has always involved difficult conversations and compromises, and that stepping into those conversations publicly can help move things forward. Her tone was firm but reflective, rooted in decades of lived experience. The audience remained quiet during this exchange, a sign that they were deeply engaged. The absence of applause or laughter allowed the weight of the conversation to settle. The camera lingered on Johansson's face as she considered Goldberg's words, capturing a moment of reflection that felt genuine rather than performative. Johansson replied that she doesn't shy away from difficult conversations, but she wants them to allow room for complexity. She said that reducing feminism to a checklist of acceptable views risks alienating people who might otherwise support the cause. Her statement was delivered calmly, but with conviction. As the segment continued, it became clear that neither side was trying to win the conversation. Instead, the exchange highlighted a real philosophical difference in how activism and representation are understood. The hosts continued to manage the discussion carefully, ensuring it remained respectful and accessible for a broad daytime audience. By this point, viewers could sense that the conversation had reached a critical juncture. The disagreement was no longer just implied, it was openly acknowledged, though still framed within mutual respect. The studio atmosphere reflected that seriousness, with fewer interruptions and a more deliberate pace. And as the segment moved toward its latter half, it was evident that this discussion would not be easily resolved within the remaining airtime, setting the stage for an even more reflective and consequential final exchange. As the segment moved into its later portion, the conversation took on a quieter, more deliberate tone, the kind that signals to viewers that something meaningful is unfolding. The moderator slowed her pace, allowing each response to land fully before moving on, and the co-hosts became more restrained in their interjections. It was clear that the discussion had reached a point where quick summaries or light reframing would no longer suffice. The moderator posed a question that seemed designed to bring the exchange toward reflection rather than debate. She asked both Johansson and Goldberg how they believe public conversations about feminism should be handled on platforms like daytime television, where audiences are broad and perspectives vary widely. The question shifted the focus from their personal disagreement to the larger responsibility of the show itself. Johansson answered first. She said that platforms like this one are valuable precisely because they allow for open dialogue in a space that is usually associated with comfort and familiarity. She explained that viewers tuning in during the day may not expect to encounter complex discussions, but that doesn't mean they aren't capable of engaging with them. Her tone was thoughtful, and she spoke more slowly than before, as if she wanted to ensure clarity. She added that she believes honesty is essential, even when it reveals disagreement. According to Johansson, presenting a single, unified message can sometimes feel disingenuous if it doesn't reflect the range of experiences women actually have. She emphasized that seeing respectful disagreement on television can help normalize the idea that feminism isn't one size fits all. Goldberg followed with her response, nodding slightly as Johansson spoke before adding her own perspective. She agreed that open dialogue is important, but she stressed that public platforms also shape narratives, whether intentionally or not. She said that shows like this have the power to influence how audiences understand social movements, and that with that power comes a responsibility to be clear about values. Goldberg explained that clarity doesn't mean eliminating nuance, but it does mean being mindful of how conversations are received by people who may not have the background context to interpret them fully. Her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness beneath it, reflecting a concern about how messages are absorbed beyond the studio. The co-hosts nodded in agreement, and one briefly added that daytime television often serves as an entry point for larger cultural conversations. That comment seemed to resonate with both Johansson and Goldberg, and for a moment, the tension eased slightly. The studio audience responded with soft applause, acknowledging the shared understanding. However, the conversation soon returned to the core disagreement. Johansson reiterated that while she respects the history of feminist activism, she wants space for individual voices that don't always align perfectly with established narratives. She spoke about how women today navigate a wide range of identities and experiences, and how rigid expectations can unintentionally exclude some of those voices. Goldberg responded by acknowledging that exclusion is a real concern, but she cautioned against diluting the movement's purpose in the process of broadening it. She said that movements rely on shared goals to create change, and that too much fragmentation can make it harder to address systemic problems. Her words were measured, but the conviction behind them was clear. The moderator stepped in again, gently reminding everyone of the limited time left in the segment. She summarized the discussion so far, highlighting the shared commitment to equality while noting the differing approaches to representation and responsibility. Her summary served as a moment of grounding, bringing the conversation back into a framework suitable for live television. Johansson responded to the summary by emphasizing that her intention has never been to distance herself from equality or activism. She clarified that she supports efforts to improve conditions for women and believes in using her platform responsibly. Her concern, she said, lies in the pressure to speak in prescribed ways rather than authentically. Goldberg listened attentively, then offered a response that felt more reflective than confrontational. She said that authenticity is important, but so is awareness of how personal choices intersect with collective struggles. She shared that over the years, she has learned that speaking up, even imperfectly, can sometimes be more impactful than staying silent out of fear of saying the wrong thing. The audience remained quiet, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. The camera captured a moment where Johansson nodded slowly, acknowledging Goldberg's point. The nod didn't signal agreement, but it did suggest understanding, and the atmosphere softened just slightly. One of the co-hosts attempted to find common ground by suggesting that perhaps feminism today is large enough to hold both perspectives. She said that movements evolve, and that conversations like this one are part of that evolution. The comment was delivered lightly, but it carried weight in the context of the discussion. Johansson agreed that evolution is necessary, adding that she hopes future conversations will allow women to speak openly, without fear of being categorized or criticized. Goldberg responded by saying that she hopes those conversations will also inspire action and accountability. Their statements weren't opposing so much as parallel, highlighting different priorities within the same broader goal. As the segment approached its final moments, the moderator thanked Johansson for engaging so openly and acknowledged Goldberg for sharing her perspective. The tone shifted slightly toward closure, but the seriousness of the discussion remained. Viewers could sense that while the conversation was winding down, its implications extended beyond the show. The studio audience offered a respectful round of applause, not loud or enthusiastic, but appreciative. It was the kind of applause that signals recognition of a meaningful exchange rather than entertainment alone. The hosts smiled, but their expressions were more thoughtful than usual. As the cameras prepared to move on, there was a sense that the discussion had left an impression, both in the studio and among viewers at home. The disagreement hadn't been resolved, but it had been explored openly and respectfully, setting the stage for reactions and conversations that would continue after the broadcast ended. As the segment drew to a close, the moderator transitioned carefully, signaling that the show needed to move on while acknowledging the weight of what had just been discussed. She thanked Scarlett Johansson again for joining the panel and briefly mentioned her upcoming project, a reminder of the original purpose of the appearance. The mention felt almost understated compared to the conversation that had unfolded, and viewers could sense that the discussion had taken on a life of its own. Johansson smiled politely as the applause began, offering a small wave to the audience. Whoopi Goldberg nodded in her direction, and there was a brief exchange of appreciative looks between them. The body language suggested mutual respect, even if their perspectives remained different. The co-hosts offered closing remarks that emphasized the value of open dialogue, reinforcing the idea that disagreement doesn't have to be divisive. The studio audience responded with sustained but measured applause. It wasn't the loud, celebratory reaction reserved for lighthearted segments, but rather a thoughtful acknowledgement of a serious conversation. As the applause faded, the show cut to commercial, leaving viewers with the sense that they had just witnessed something more substantial than a typical daytime interview. Almost immediately after the episode aired, reactions began appearing across social media. Clips of the exchange circulated quickly, with viewers sharing short excerpts and offering their interpretations. Some praised Johansson for articulating a perspective that resonated with women who value personal autonomy and flexibility within feminist discourse. Others applauded Goldberg for emphasizing collective responsibility and the historical context of the movement. Commentators noted how restrained and respectful the exchange had been, especially given the intensity of the topic. Many viewers expressed appreciation for seeing a nuanced discussion on daytime television, a space often associated with lighter fare. Some pointed out the contrast between the calm tone of the conversation and the more polarized debates common on social media platforms. In the hours that followed, both Johansson and Goldberg were discussed widely in opinion pieces and online commentary. Headlines varied in how they framed the exchange, with some emphasizing the disagreement and others focusing on the mutual respect shown throughout. Several commentators highlighted the generational aspect of the conversation, noting how different life experiences can shape views on activism and representation. The show itself addressed the segment the following day. One of the hosts referenced the discussion briefly, acknowledging the viewer response and reiterating that the intention was to create space for honest conversation. She emphasized that the show values diverse perspectives and welcomes dialogue that challenges assumptions. Goldberg also made a brief comment during a later episode, clarifying that her remarks were rooted in her belief in collective progress rather than criticism of any individual. She stressed that disagreement within movements can be healthy when handled with respect. Her tone suggested a desire to move the conversation forward rather than revisit conflict. Johansson, for her part, responded to the discussion in a subsequent interview, reiterating her support for gender equality and expressing appreciation for the opportunity to engage in a thoughtful exchange. She emphasized that her views had been shared in good faith and that she welcomed ongoing dialogue about how feminism is defined and practiced. Viewers continued to debate this segment online, with many sharing personal stories about how the conversation resonated with their own experiences. Some said they felt seen by Johansson's emphasis on personal choice, while others connected more strongly with Goldberg's focus on collective action. The discussion extended beyond the show, becoming part of a broader cultural conversation about how social movements adapt over time. What stood out to many was not the disagreement itself, but the way it unfolded. The exchange remained grounded, respectful, and appropriate for a daytime audience, demonstrating that serious topics can be discussed without raising voices or resorting to sensationalism. For some viewers, it served as a reminder that disagreement doesn't have to mean division. As the conversation continued in the public sphere, the segment became an example of how talk shows can serve as platforms for meaningful dialogue rather than just entertainment. It also reinforced the idea that feminism, like many movements, is shaped by ongoing discussion and reflection. In the end, the moment on the show didn't offer a definitive conclusion, but it did invite viewers to think more deeply about the issues raised. And that, for many, was the most impactful outcome. If you watched the segment, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.